Now we have to talk about what's going on in the world. No one, that's all we're thinking about the last days. Can you give us your reading of what's going on in Gaza and Israel?
Well, the thing about Gaza, Israel right now is that many of us journalists who have been covering the Middle East for years, and certainly my colleagues who have been there for longer than me, have been covering the periodic conflicts between, in Gaza and between Gaza and Israel, Hamas and Israel, and, unrest in the occupied West Bank, situation in Jerusalem. I mean, this has been going on for years. The attacks, though, Saturday before last, were unlike anything we've ever seen before. Hamas entering Israel in such massive numbers, purposely, effectively rebranding themselves along the ISIS line of true terror, true attacks on civilians, filming it. This is terror at its heart, really, really at its most potent, really very much so targeting civilians. We've never seen that on that scale before. Equally so, we've never seen bombings on this scale, even in Gaza, where we've seen horrendous amounts of civilian deaths over the years, again and again and again. In 2014, when I was in Gaza, the civilian deaths were just by far the largest number. And this is just totally normal now. Many children included in that. But now it's absolutely off the charts. I think it's also really important for people to understand that, if we look at this conflict, it's so emotional, and so many people are, it's one of the most tricky stories ever to cover. Israel-Palestine is very difficult. Everybody, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. No matter what you're reporting on, people will be upset. And right now that is times 1,000. But one thing that I try to teach my students and try to talk to other people about whenever they come to me and ask me is to talk as much as I can about international humanitarian law. If we can have any line in the sand between, when morality is moving and swirling around, what we need to talk about is, what is legal, in what is, because effectively we're talking about what is held up in human decency globally. And, right. Obviously Hamas's attacks against civilians, it's a crime to purposely kill civilians. It's a crime to take them as hostages. It's also a crime to indiscriminately drop bombs on people. It's a crime to collectively punish civilian populations. It's a crime to prevent them gaining access to the means they need to survive: food, water, medicine. And so it really worries me that just more broadly these days, we're starting to see the flouting of certain taboos of behavior. And it's really, really scary. And I think that more is to come. I think it's really terrifying if the world is not calling for peaceful solutions to conflicts, rather than simply saying retribution is fine. And
it strikes many of us that we've been saying a war crime is a war crime in the Ukraine-Russia theater, not so much in Gaza, Israel at all.
And we must do at this point more than ever, as rhetoric becomes, particularly really, really nerve-wrackingly genocidal. And we also see it as people start to strangely try to somehow make some sort of justification for Hamas, as though they represent a Palestinian resistance. And then on the other side, you have people completely blaming everybody in Gaza. This is where we absolutely need to hold tight to what is a crime and what is not a crime. I think it's also worth pointing out, Elizabeth, it worries me that more and more people don't seem to realize that journalists are not allowed into Gaza. It's not that they're not going because it's dangerous. And I'm sure only the most experienced and most steely war reporters would go in if they could, but they would go. Gaza is locked off. It is impossible to get any journalists in there right now. And now there are many Gazan journalists and very brave and brilliant Palestinian journalists reporting there, but it's extremely difficult right now. There's so much misinformation flooding the internet, flooding social media, and also being put out there by various people publicly. And so that access for journalists is really vital.
And it comes to a question that unfortunately has been coming up since here in the United States since President Trump, that journalism they are the enemy of the people. And now you see what happens when you don't have journalists witnessing, and you don't have Gazan, how many, over a dozen Gazan journalists have already been killed.
Yeah, I believe it's at least 15.
Yeah, and I just read a report that Israel has asked Al Jazeera to stop reporting out of Jerusalem, so on and so forth. I'm going to see if we have any questions. We don't have any questions in chat. Are people being shy? If you have a question, please put it in chat. I mean, I have more questions, but I want other people to have a chance to talk to Jane. While we're waiting, the interesting part of what's going on now in some ways is Egypt, and you also reported from Egypt. Why are the Egyptians behaving the way they are? Are they worried about Palestinians coming in and never leaving a la Jordan? Are they worried about the war expanding? It seems, I mean, they're governed by a horrible leader, but it doesn't seem to make sense.
Well, Egypt has always had this sort of interesting relationship, with Israel, in the sense that, they are openly very critical of Israeli occupation of the West Bank and of the siege on Gaza, but at the same time, they also kind of participate because they control a border and a boundary in and out. So Egypt finds itself often, indirectly complying with some of the like they are doing right now with the border. But Egypt is a very tricky and interesting country diplomatically right now, as is everybody. The idea that the Arab world is united over this situation is absolutely untrue. Every country has its own interests, and for Egypt right now, they're effectively an incredibly brutal dictatorship that has been repressing their own people, repressing dissent. Is essentially the government is a government that came about because of a military coup 10 years ago. But they themselves have been sort of getting it from the White House, supposedly. I mean, I would say probably not loudly enough, but they're under pressure for their own human rights record. So they're effectively saying, oh, okay, so this is hypocrisy. You're giving us a hard time about human rights, but you're backing Israel in their bombardment. And so, there's been off the record threats that they would we'll let Palestinians into northern Egyptian land and then send them to Europe on boats across the Mediterranean, which would obviously be devastating for Palestinians. I mean, thinking of not only being displaced again, but also the danger of those Mediterranean crossings. So they've obviously got their own issues as well that they're negotiating with the United States on. In terms of military aid, some of that gets held up because the United States gives them a hard time about their human rights. Also, as you've pointed out, they have a massive economic crisis right now. Do they want 1.2, potentially more, million very destitute, poor people coming in with huge needs economically and the need for support? From their perspective, just economically, this would be a massive strain on an economy which is really teetering right now.